Let's begin. Welcome, everyone. Let me introduce myself to some of you who are new. I'm Martin Sanchez-Jankowski, and I am the chair of the Center for Ethnographic Research. I also am the director of the Institute, which is the umbrella organization that houses the center. I would like, before we begin the formal presentation today, to ask you to check your cell phones and make sure that they're on silent. And after that's done, or while that's being done, let me announce a next event that is occurring on November the 1st. And it is also part of the Center for Ethnographic Research's Colloquium series. And it is a presentation by Professor Ann Laudati, who's she's a postdoc in geography here. I think she's also somewhat of an ad hoc professor. This will take place from 4 to 5:30 in this room, and the title of her talk is Dangerous Research, Reflections on Fieldwork in an Insecure Context, Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I think that would be terribly interesting. Let me just describe some of the format for those of you who are somewhat new. Our speaker will address us for about 45 minutes. And after the cessation of that address, I will come up here again and act as sort of the person who collects hands, not literally, but raise your hand and I'll put you in the queue for the speaker to answer questions. And your hand can come up before the speaker talks or while the speaker is talking, and I'll put you in the queue. So the speaker only's responsibility is answering the question and not deciding who's going to be chosen to ask the question. Now it's my pleasure actually to introduce our speaker today, who is Professor Alvaro Jarrín, who is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. He received his PhD in Cultural Anthropology from Duke University. He has publications in a number of journals: Transgender Studies, Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies, Medical Anthropology. Today's talk is on a book he wrote and has been published. And it is a talk that utilizes the same title of the book, which is The Biopolitics of Beauty, Cosmetic Citizenship, and Affective Capital in Brazil. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jarrín.
So thank you so much for the introduction. I wanted to thank Martin Sanchez-Jankowski for inviting me, for becoming interested in my work. I want to thank the Center for Ethnographic Research, the Center for Latin American Studies for co-sponsoring this talk. And I especially want to thank Deborah Friedman-Lustig and Shari Solars for organizing the talk and the logistics of bringing me here, like everything. They made it possible, so I really appreciate them for that work. So today I'm going to talk about the biopolitics of beauty and about plastic surgery in Brazil. And I want to begin with two things. So during this talk, I'm going to think of beauty first as a biopolitical project, and I'm going to think of beauty as an affective process. What do I mean by that? By biopolitical, I mean that beauty has become an aim of public health in Brazil and has been made available to low-income patients in public hospitals since the 1960s. The surgeons who make these surgeries possible are considered humanitarians. They're highly admired in society for offering plastic surgery to the poor. In particular, one surgeon called Ivo Pitangui. If you're Brazilian, if there's any Brazilians in the audience, you probably have all heard of Ivo Pitangui. He's a household name, one of the most famous surgeons in Brazil. And he was the first to popularize this idea of the right to beauty, o direito à beleza. And he believed that everyone in society should be provided beauty, not only people who can pay for it. And the way that he justified this in the 1960s, and the way he got the support of then President Kubitschek for this process, for this expansion of public surgery into public hospitals, is he talked about uplifting the poor through beauty, right? So that's why I think of beauty as a biopolitical project, because it was actually about not only individuals becoming beautiful, but about populations becoming beautiful and improving actually the race. So I'm going to get to the raciological aspects of this in a bit. But it was about including in the nation through beauty, which is problematic. The second thing I'm going to talk about is affect and affective processes. Working class patients, I argue, have embodied affective responses to beauty. And in fact, they don't call it the right to beauty. Some of them do, but a lot of them actually use the term the dictatorship of beauty. So they understood it as oppressive. They understood it as a mandate that they couldn't say no to. They felt it was mandatory to be beautiful. And they always tied it to class, race, and gender inequalities that they suffered in their day-to-day. So one of the reasons why I play with biopolitics and affect is because I think it gives us an answer to why the patients and the surgeons understood beauty in very different ways. And I think that's important. So this is the Ivo Pitangui Institute. So the very famous surgeon I was telling you about, he opened this institute in 1960. And this is what the waiting room looks like today, right? So a lot of my ethnographic fieldwork, I spent a lot of time sitting with people. And because this is not a private clinic, it actually took a very long time for patients to get surgery. So they would come at 5 a.m. and they would wait to get a number, and then they would have to sit for hours here waiting for their name to be called. And they had to be seen by a medical resident, by a psychologist, and then another doctor. In order, they had to jump through these loopholes, not these loopholes, but these gatekeeping mechanisms in order to get access to surgery. And sometimes it took months, sometimes it took years for the surgery to actually be scheduled because the demand was incredibly high, right? But the good thing about the fact that it was a long waiting period is because it really gave me access to these patients. The patients were like, oh, you want an anthropologist wants to talk to me about this? Sure, I'll talk. I don't have nothing else to do but wait. So they were willing to talk to me, sometimes in groups, sometimes individually. So I got really fantastic information from them, which was very, very useful. In terms of the doctors, I was surprised about how much access the doctors were willing to give me. Initially, I was told no because I wanted to do a project on medical tourists. So I wanted to do a project on Americans and Europeans going to Brazil for plastic surgery because I knew that's a phenomenon that happens as well. And the surgeon said, no, I'm not interested in giving you access to these patients. You might scare them away. You're right, it's not a thing. I said, what about your private Brazilian patients? No, I'm not comfortable with that. And the surgeons themselves would tell me, well, why don't you study the public hospitals? And I was like, what do you mean the public hospitals? Oh, don't you know public hospitals offer plastic surgery to the poor? And that's the population that you should be studying. And I only realized later that the reason they thought about these populations as apt for studying is because they consider these working class populations as objects of study, of knowledge. They use these populations as experimental subjects to develop new techniques, to train young surgeons, and they consider it as the basis of knowledge production, right? So in fact, this is why this is a surgeon taking a picture of a patient. They would always take these very detailed pictures. And they made the patients get naked in front of groups of people in a way that would never happen in a private clinic. So the way they were treated was very differently than in a private clinic. And not only that, but the reason I began to think of the importance of race in this whole thing and why I began to think of beauty as biopolitical is because eugenics kept coming up. So in 2009, when I was doing field work, a plastic surgeon who is pretty famous and who prides himself on having produced a lot of Miss Brazils, so he's known for doing plastic surgeries on women who became candidates and eventually won Miss Brazil contests. He told me, miscegenation or racial mixture improve the eugenic condition of the population, and beautification techniques aid eugenics because they help people remain youthful and improve themselves. And it almost seems anachronistic, right, that you have a 21st century surgeon talking about eugenics as something valid, right? And he thinks of it as, he thinks of racial mixture, he thinks of miscegenation as producing a eugenic population, and he thinks of plastic surgery as complementing the work of eugenics, right? If you go, again, to Ivo Pitangui, the very famous Brazilian plastic surgeon, used the word eugenicist in his work. He talked about everyone not only having the right to beauty, but everyone having to search for eugenesis in his words, or the condition of being eugenic. If you go even further back in time, 1933, José Rebelo Neto, who is known as the father of Brazilian plastic surgery, because he founded the Brazilian Society of Plastic Surgeons, and he defended the discipline in the public debates about plastic surgery at the time. He defended his practice. He argued that plastic surgery was a valid practice because it works in favor of an ideal of beauty, hygiene, and eugenics. So a lot of people have a hard time in the US to connect plastic surgery to eugenics because they're used to the type of eugenics that is associated with not the Nazi regime, for example, or in the US, right? There was eugenics programs that sought to eliminate certain populations. They actually sterilized, for example, African American women in North Carolina. They sterilize people with mental disabilities, right? So there's a history of eugenics in the US and obviously in Europe as well, right? And we consider eugenics to only be tied to that, to the elimination of populations considered unfit, right? But the historian Nancy Leigh Steppen has writes about this extensively. She talks about the neo-Lamarckian eugenics that were developed in Latin America in response to this type of eugenics that was happening in Europe and the United States. So to give you a quick example, in 1874, Count de Gobineau, who was a French count, had lived some time in Brazil. He goes back to France and he describes Brazilians in this publication that he puts out as a completely mulatto population, polluted in the blood and the spirit and frighteningly ugly, right? So he argues that because people have mixed so much, they've become ugly and degenerate in some kind of way, right? This very important idea of degeneration that was tied to eugenics. The Brazilian intellectuals, their reaction was to say, no. These people have it wrong. Racial mixture is good for the race because it eventually makes whiteness predominant, and it drops away blackness and indigenousness and other things that are not good for the nation, right? So it's not less racist. That's why it's still eugenics, right? It was still very problematic. It was based on the idea of white supremacy. However, it was about mixture being a positive instead of a negative, right? Because racial mixture was a fact of Brazil, right? They couldn't undo that, but they could rethink it as a positive, right? So you have Afrânio Peixoto wanting to prove Gobineau wrong and saying, Gobineau predicted that children are dying in such high quantities that in the matter of a few negligible years there will be no more Brazilians. Not only is the Brazilian population growing enormously, but racial mixture is also rapidly increasing. Pure blacks do not exist anymore. Mestizos disappear because they die prematurely or because they interbreed with whiter elements, thus the race widens. In Brazil, the great race, which has assimilated and depurated the other two races, and desirable only due to their uncultured condition and ugliness, is the white race, right? So whiteness eliminates the other inferior races, according to Afrânio Peixoto, who's a famous medical legal scholar, still respected until today in Brazil. You have sexologist and eugenicist Hernani Dirajá talking about racial mixture again as a eugenic element. So he writes a book called The Morphology of Woman, Female Plasticity in Brazil in 1931. The whole book is about, it's sort of this pedagogical book that teaches man how to find beauties, the true beauties in Brazil, in order to produce a better nation, to produce better offspring. And this illustration comes from the book. And if you notice, it's a black woman plus an indigenous woman plus a white man produces a beautiful, right, European-looking woman of some sort, right? And he felt that lower types, if as long as they were healthy, and he sort of talks about all these diseases that make women unfit for reproduction. But she said, as long as they're fit, etc., if white men reproduce with black women and indigenous women, they can be redeemed, and they can produce true beauties for the nation. So beauty, you begin to see, gets inscribed in the nation as a sign of racial progress. If the country is becoming more beautiful, it means it's progressing racially, right? It's eliminating the unfit in some kind of way, right? Renato Kell, who is a founder of the Eugenic Society of Sao Paulo, writes a book in 1923 called The Cure of Ugliness, and the cure of ugliness is eugenics in the book. And he argues in the book that ugliness is not something that's random or that's social or that, but he actually thinks it's a product of degeneration and disease. And he argues that as long as we teach people to be eugenic in their practices and to be hygienic in their practices, we will produce a better nation, right? And of course, race is also part of what he thinks about. So for example, he has a whole chapter where he talks about plastic surgery. So he's one of the first people to defend plastic surgery, even before Jose Rebelo Neto, who I told you was the father of Brazilian plastic surgery. It is 10 years before Jose Rebelo Neto proposed that plastic surgery was eugenic. But Kell was already talking about plastic surgery as a great thing that we should do in the future. And he said, thanks to it, how many deformities will our eyes be spared from? How many young girls that are robust and have perfect bodies, but who have deformed noses, will not get their noses reformed in Greek or Roman styles, right? And again, race is lurking in the background, right? Europeanness is desirable, other things are not, for their own delight and the delight of their admirers. So jumping back to the present, when I was doing ethnographic research with plastic surgeons, and I spent as much time with the surgeons as I did with the patients, because I found the surgeons fascinating and problematic, and I just kept wanting to hear what they had to say about race. And it surprised me how much race came up. So even when they were talking about surgeries that didn't seem to have anything to do with race, they would bring up race themselves, right? So, for example, there was a group of plastic surgeons at a conference. They were chatting, and I joined them, and I introduced myself as an anthropologist, and I asked them, why is plastic surgery so appealing in Brazil? And their answer was, it makes white women desire the buttocks and breasts of black women, and it makes everyone else desire European noses. And just to break this down a bit, I think this is important, right? Because they're thinking again of like the whole Brazilian population creating a middle, becoming homogeneous through plastic surgery, but it's different, right? They imagine the bodies of white women becoming racialized, right, in some kind of way, approximating black bodies by becoming more buxom, more curvy, or something like that, more sensuous, right? But when it comes to the face, they always think the face should be closer to whiteness. So they never thought, somebody who has too much of a white face should get a nose that's more Afro-Brazilian. They never told me that. It was always, everyone wants European noses, and that's a good thing, according to plastic surgeons. In fact, they use the term Negroid nose as an actual condition that could be diagnosed, that could be treated, that could be surgically corrected. They use it all the time. In conferences, when talking to one another, when talking to me, when presenting, right? So one time there was this surgery that was going to take place, nose surgery. The teenage girl who wanted the surgery mostly complained about it being too wide, but she didn't use the term Negroid nose, right? And the surgeon brought it up, right? She said, when I asked him, why does this teenage girl need a nose job? And he said, this girl has a typical Brazilian beauty, except for the nose. She is morena, brown, a product of miscegenation. She wanted to correct not only the shape, but also reduce the width of the nostrils, but it would create a scar and appear artificial. The Negroid nose is very common in the Brazilian race, right? So this is one of the ways that plastic surgeons produce homogeneity, and it's not only them. In general, Brazil tries to produce homogeneity in the population by talking about the Brazilian race and trying to deny the fact that there might be Afro-Brazilians or indigenous Brazilians or people who basically are different in the nation, right? Everyone's Brazilian according to this ideology of racial democracy, right? We're all equal here. But the Negroid nose is a problem in that homogeneity, right? Needs to be corrected. This is pictures that I took from an article, a published article by doctors, Brazilian doctors, talking about the Negroid nose and telling other doctors, how do you identify the Negroid nose? How do you diagnose the Negroid nose, right? And they actually use anthropometry, right? So they use old Ambrosian techniques of measuring people's angles and faces and measurements to say these particular angles, right, of a nose are what determines a Negroid nose. And it's very problematic, and you can see that the photograph is accompanied by this very racialized, very antiquated kind of racial description of people of African descent, right? But the other thing that fascinated me about this article is that this black patient was never shown, the after pictures were never shown. it wasn't understood as if she even deserved a nose job, because she was seen as the typical Negro nose. She's the problem, right, in some kind of way. Instead, the patient that was thought of as correct, as benefiting from correction, was this patient, right? That slightly lighter skinned patient, right? And she was, the article described her as morena, as brown, not as black, right? And supposedly, right, her nose has become better by becoming thinner in this imagination of the thing. So she deserved the correction of the Negro nose. She no longer has one, according to this article. Whenever I ask plastic surgeons, so what's the ideal beauty? Like, what do you strive for? They would always bring up white supermodels, white TV actresses, right? And always women too, right? It was interesting. They never brought up men. So they would always bring up white women who are Brazilian, but who are clearly white, right? As the ideal of Brazilianness, right? A medical resident specializing in plastic surgery told me the mixture of the races in Brazil left a lot of people with the wrong nose or ear, again, facial features, right? That is why people do surgery, to look like those beautiful people that makes less. Like the models Gisele Bündchen and Daniela Sicarelli. Sometimes whole families undergo nose surgery, so they do not have their father's nose. So he understands here, right? Racial mixture is understood as a problem, that it's sometimes a positive, but sometimes bad things happen, it creates issues. Plastic surgery is there to correct the problems when there's too much racial mixture, right? And again, whiteness is the ideal. Gisele Bündchen is probably one of the most wealthy Brazilian supermodels, and it's in every other ad in Brazil. So there is a reality to the economic power that whiteness has in the public sphere that accompanies. This is why when plastic surgeons say this, most people would simply agree, right? So now let's turn to the patients, right? Because what bothers me about some people who write about plastic surgery is they talk about these problematic things that plastic surgeons say and do, and then they just assume that those medical discourses are internalized uncritically by patients. And one of the things that I found that I think is the most interesting in my research is that we cannot simply assume that. Patients don't simply internalize medical discourses. Something more complex is happening. And that's why I turned to affect. So affect theory talks, for example, William Mazzarella argues that affect gets at the way in which society is inscribed in our nervous system and in our flesh before it appears in our consciousness, right? So there's this precognitive reaction that's social, right? But that is visceral reaction to things that make, again, the social be inscribed in our flesh and before we are even conscious of it. Another theorist about affect that I really like, Brian Masumi, he argues that perception itself, right, the fact that we can see each other or that we hear each other, all these senses, our senses, according to him, are socialized in very powerful ways. And the visceral reactions to the world around us may seem instinctual, right? But they're actually shaped by affective form of cognitions that cannot be reduced to discourse or language, but are social. So he's argued there's other ways that we're socializing that is not simply through language, which is interesting to me, right? The body gets socialized in a very powerful way. Just one more theorist that I like, Sarah Ahmed, talks about affect circulating through the body politic and sticking to certain bodies that are considered positive or negative according to the level of perception, right? So she argues, she uses it mostly to talk about American reactions to Muslim Americans, right? And to things like the veil or a turban the Sikhs wear, right? And she says people have visceral negative reactions to these bodies because they're imparted negative value in the public sphere, right? And these affects circulate in the body politic in particular ways, right? So I apply that to beauty, and I argue that beauty, right, circulates in the Brazilian body politic in a particular way that imparts negative and positive value to people, and it creates a hierarchy, right? It creates what I call an aesthetic hierarchy of beauty. So if beauty and ugliness are the opposite poles of this aesthetic hierarchy, right, race, class, and gender circulate, right, and provide value in that hierarchy, right? So let's think of the hierarchy sort of like as a globe, right, with beauty at the top and ugliness at the bottom. And whiteness, gender normativity, and wealth are thought of as approximating beauty and on the other hand, blackness, gender variance, and poverty are thought of as approximating ugliness, right? The one exception is the bodily erotics, right? So erotic bodies that are, blackness is tied to erotics and sensuality in Brazil in a way that it does give it some value, but I'll talk about how it's not complete value, right? And the face is very much tied to whiteness and whitening in some kind of way or another. So I'll start with race, right? With whiteness being understood as the norm. So upper middle class patients very much completely embraced the idea that whiteness was the norm that everyone should strive to, right? So Rosa, who was a woman in her 50s of Lebanese descent, had her first surgery when she was only 15 years old, and then she had several other surgeries throughout her life, almost one every 10 years, right? This is very common for upper middle class women in Brazil who can afford it. And she said, I got a nose job that was paid by my father. Everyone in their family got a nose job, right? All her siblings got a nose job when they were turned 15. All her female siblings and cousins got a nose job when they turned 15. And she said that this surgery was very important because it was necessary for the women in her family to fit into the quote-unquote national beauty standard, right? So the national beauty standard, again, is a white, homogeneous standard, and she thought of her nose as marking her as an outsider, right? Because it marked the family as Lebanese. But it's very gendered, right? It's fascinating that it's only the women in the family who got the nose job and not the men. Beatriz was a college student in her 20s. She was white. She was from a wealthy family, middle upper class family living in Leblon. And she decided to get your surgery because her parents had already had it. So I was also fascinated with how these surgeries ran in families in some kind of way. So they weren't physically inherited, but they were inherited just through practice from one generation to the next. So her two parents had had ear surgery. She was having ear surgery. But the reason she gave me is she said her classmates had always called her macaca, monkey, and she felt she had a cara de mal. She had the face of a bad person. And the way I interpret this is there's a weird way in which she felt racialized from this because macaco it's a very strong racial epithet in Brazil. It's only used against Afro-Brazilians, right, in most cases. So the fact that her classmates were calling her a monkey, to me, it's impossible to disassociate that from the racial epithet. And I think it really clearly had there was something going there where she felt racialized by her ears. And the fact that she said, I don't want to bat the face of a person, right? Like, why was she thinking that her ears made her look like a criminal unless there was some weird way in which she felt it racialized her in some way, right? And there's a very long history of using criminology to racialize crime in Brazil, and sort of it emphasizes the huge disparities, right, between black and white in Brazil. It's a very racially unequal country. The upper middle class patients also sought to distance themselves from black women. So Ligia, who was a woman in her 50s who was getting a facelift, right? She told me specifically that she did not want to look like a mulatta. She said mulattas become too muscular when they work out. They already have bodies like that naturally, and then they end up with six-packs and abs and legs that are too muscular. It's not pretty. People who are dark-skinned cannot get plastic surgery anyway, right? They end up with keloids. The result is not as good. So this patient imagined surgery as something that was only available to the white. She didn't think of plastic surgery as being available to people of color in Brazil. And she specifically said the mulattas are too physical, right? Their bodies are too much, too muscular, too something. I don't want that for me. She was not the only one who said this. A lot of upper middle class white patients I talked to in Rio de Janeiro and Belo Horizonte talked about blackness as something that was very distant from them, and they didn't want it in any kind of way. And they wanted, and it's interesting because even though, remember, the plastic surgeon said that white women wanted the buttocks and breasts of black women, the women would never tell me that. They would say, no, I want to look like Gisele Bündchen. I want to look like a supermodel. I want to be very thin. Liposuction is incredibly popular in the upper middle class. And it's all about containing, right? Creating a body that's contained in some kind of way, right? But blackness does have its place in the Brazilian popular culture, right? So, for example, every carnival, this image is of a globeleza. So every carnival, TV Globo used to, until recently, elect a globeleza, a global samba queen. So they would find one, right, through some process, and then they would show her naked, usually just painted with with some colored paints usually. And her only role was to dance samba in a vignette before every samba school started, right? So she was just like, oh, Carnival's here because the Globalesa has been elected and she's going to show up on TV, right? She's a very important iconic figure in Brazil, right? Or samba queens in general, right, are very important in Brazil. However, I was always struck by the fact that she was completely silenced in the sense that she never got to say a word in those vignettes. She just danced the samba and then left. And that was pretty much, right? That was her whole show, right? So it's a valuation of blackness that's very much tied to just valuing the body, the physicality, not giving these women really much agency, at least in TV, right? And again, most people would consider these women sensual, but not beautiful, which is an important distinction in Brazil, right? They eroticize them, but they don't think of them as beautiful like Gisele Bündchen. So when it comes to the working class women, right? So far it sounds like the patients, upper class male patients, have a similar racial ideology to the plastic surgeons, and I think that has to do with the fact that they come from a similar class and similar racial background. But when I talked to working class patients, they began to show me that there was some incipient critique of racial inequality. So Julia was bringing her grandson for ear surgery, and the grandson was only 10. The grandson was barely understood why he was there, right? But Julia was convinced that this was very important, and she had the full support of the kid's parents to do the ear surgery. And she said he needs to fix his ear so he won't have the same problem as his mother and father. His mother and father made him wrong. He arrived with a manufacturing error, so now he needs fixing. People have plastic surgery done so they are not different from others, to feel included in their social group, to not have those ears that nose those lips that cause suffering. Well, apariencia, good appearance, is important to be successful in the job market. People who say that is not the case are just saying that outwardly, but think differently. Only in a concurso público, which is an exam-based public service job, they will have to hire you if you are smart, even if you are black. For all other professions, though, appearance is important, very much so. The talk about everyone having the same opportunities is just demagoguery, right? So she's critiquing racial inequality here, right? She's saying racism is real, racism exists, and I just can't have my child go through this, and I need to do something to fix it. So it was interesting because they were participating in plastic surgery, which is, I argue, right, a very problematic raciological practice in Brazil. But they were able to critique it in a way that I think is important for an anthropologist to sort of note, at least, right? So the second axis, gender. Gender, of course, central to plastic surgery, not only in Brazil, but around the world, right? Plastic surgery is understood mostly as a female practice in Brazil. Women receive approval in the public hospitals, right? Women receive approval for surgeries much more easily, right? Any kind of lack of femininity is medicalized as an issue by doctors, right? So for example, again, a mother and daughter came to the clinic, the public health clinic, and they wanted breast implants for the teenage daughter who had small breasts, right? And she simply complained about, I don't fit in, I just want to look in a certain way, and I feel like I'm not developed enough, right? But what fascinated me was the surgeon immediately medicalized the issue and actually diagnosed it as hypertrophy of the mammary glands, right? Gave it a name, and then the mother was like, oh, so it's a condition, right? It's a medical problem that needs correction. And this is what he used to justify the surgery in the eyes of the state, which is also important, right? Getting the state to pay for it because they couldn't afford it. These women, or women in general, tied feminine biological processes such as giving birth and breastfeeding to the repairs that they felt they deserved later in life. So a lot of women said, my body has changed because I had 3 kids. I breastfed those 3 kids. It's not the same body as before. I want to have the body that I had when I was younger, and therefore plastic surgery is the only solution. So they thought of it as a bit of going back in time in some kind of way. But I was also fascinated about the fact that they thought of it as a form of leisure and self-care. So there was one particular patient who told me she worked as a domestic worker, so she was always working for cleaning other people's homes, right? Which is a very underpaid work in Brazil, type of work in Brazil, and it can sometimes be abusive. And she said, and then I have to go home and I have to take care of my kids, and I have to take care of my husband, I have to always take care of others. And she said, I'm so happy that I'm getting the surgery because for 6 weeks they're going to have to, during the recovery period, they're going to have to take care of me. And my husband's going to have to rub my feet. and my mother-in-law's going to have to do it. So she would look forward to the time when she would actually be able to not do anything. In fact, her husband was completely against the surgery, and she was doing it against his will, which fascinated me, right? And so there is some way in which, even though surgeries are very problematically gendered, we can think of it as a way of for working class women to get a little bit back of agency back in some kind of ways, right? When it comes to men who want surgery, it's very taboo for men to want plastic surgery. They can only get it if it somehow remasculinizes the body. So, for example, gynecomastia was a very popular, is one of the surgeries I saw the most in public hospitals, and it's basically a type of surgery that corrects excessive breast tissue in males, right? So basically what we call man boobs in English, right? So men who felt like, oh, I have too much of this, and I feel somewhat feminine or not masculine enough, they thought of it as a correction, and the surgeons thought of it as a valid correction, and they approved these surgeries very often, right? Also, it's becoming a bit more popular to do liposuction to define the male body. So this man was getting plastic surgery to redefine his pectoral muscles and his abs, and therefore this was considered okay, right? It wasn't as taboo for him to want this because it seemed like it went along with, let's say, working out. We just thought of the male practice, right? But if a patient came and wanted something that women want, usually like a facelift, then it was denied. So the psychologists who weed out, their whole job in the public hospitals is to weed out problem patients. They would weed out patients that they felt are going to be problematic after they get a surgery. They're never going to be happy. They're going to complain too much, right? So there was ways in which they made the life for the plastic surgeons easier, right? And they also weeded out patients that they thought were quote unquote strange, right? So a man who wanted a facelift and who described his facelift in a very similar way to what the women described it as, right? Oh, I just want to look younger and I want to lose some wrinkles, etc. The psychologist immediately flagged this guy and said he's probably a homosexual, and I don't think we should approve him. So it was undercurrent of homophobia that structured the way men were treated, right? Also, a very strong current of transphobia. So trans-identified patients are routinely excluded from plastic surgery in public hospitals. Plastic surgery is supposed to remasculinize male bodies and refeminize female bodies, but never transit in between, right? So travestis, which is the most one of the most important gender non-conforming identities in Brazil. It's local to Brazil. I actually saw a travesti go to a public hospital, demand breast implants, and be laughed at and basically run out of the hospital. So they were very violent about their exclusion of trans patients all the time, right? There's ways in which people who identify as transsexual, which is different from travesti, right? If you adopt the Western medical nomenclature, and you have to undergo a 2-year process of psychological counseling to prove that you are apt for surgery, then they will start giving you access to, like, sort of homotherapy and breast and types of surgery, but it's very, very difficult to go through that process, and a lot of people get denied. So the whole process is transphobic in very serious ways. The third one, and perhaps the most important one, is class, right? So the undercurrent among all the patients, right, was that ugliness is the product of living a hard life. So they said, the reason I'm ugly is because I've led a very hard life. Ugliness is thought of as a source of suffering, a source of objection, a type of social death. One patient told me once that being ugly made her feel so ashamed, it's as if I was the living dead, right? So for her, ugliness literally made her not fully alive in some kind of intense way, right? And I think that's why I go towards affect, because it's so visceral, right? These people really suffer because they're ugly, or they perceive themselves as ugly, right? It's a real feeling that we can't just ignore. And beauty is not something superficial, right? On the other hand, right, beauty is thought of as opening doors. Beauty opens doors is a popular Brazilian saying. A lot of people I interviewed talked about beleza abre portas, and beauty opens doors in one way or another. And working class patients thought of beauty as a form of lack. So they was always talk about, like, the wealthy are always beautiful, or they can get beauty. I cannot. It's a type of capital. For them, beauty is a type of capital, what I call in a form of affective capital, right? Because it's so much tied to affect. that is inaccessible to them, that they desperately want. It's another thing that the wealthy have that they do not have. But they think that beauty somehow and wealth are so interconnected they can actually change your life, right? So they think wealth gives beauty on the one hand. So Samara once said, there are no ugly people, only poor people. And I was confused at first about what she meant by that. So I asked her, can you tell me a bit more about that? She said, I believe there are social classes where there are more beautiful people. I believe the more money you have, the greater the probability that you are more beautiful. For various reasons. You eat better, you lead a better life, you can get plastic surgery. Of course there are beautiful people, beautiful poor people, and very ugly rich people. But most rich people I see are beautiful. And when they are not naturally beautiful, they make themselves beautiful. So people, particularly in the working class, thought of beauty as something that could be acquired through wealth. You could buy your way into beauty. The opposite is also true, according to the people I interviewed. Beauty is supposed to give you wealth. So there's narratives of upward mobility through beauty in all of Brazilian popular culture, right? Whether it be stories in novels or soap operas, beauty contests, reality TV shows. Everywhere you see, there's these narratives that say if you're beautiful, you're gonna move up in society, right? In a soap opera, the typical thing is a poor girl gets recognized as beautiful and becomes a model, or marries up, or something happens to her that she becomes suddenly wealthy, right, by the end of the soap opera. In reality shows / beauty contests, the one that fascinated me the most was one called the Beauty in the Favela, right? So the favelas are the slums in Brazil. And the whole premise of Beauty in the Favela is they would send these modeling scouts / reporters to favelas all around Brazil, right? It was a huge beauty contest, all right? And they would pick out, the scouts would decide, right? They wouldn't let the communities decide who they thought was beautiful. They would decide who was beautiful. They would create mini contests, and then there would be like a statewide contest, and then eventually there was a whole nationwide contest to see which one is the most beautiful girl from the favela, right? And so I followed it throughout the whole thing, and then at the very end they had a big finale, right, to decide who was the girl who was the most beautiful. And what struck me was how white these girls were, right? Most of the girls in the favelas in Brazil are not white, right? They're Afro-Brazilian girls. But the reporters, because they were from Sao Paulo and they were white, they picked the girls who were light-eyed, and they picked the girls who had straight hair, and they picked the girls who were, of course, tall and thin, and the girls who had thin noses. So by the time you got to the finale, all the girls were suddenly white, right? So they were picking out the girls that looked like they didn't belong in the favela and put them in this national contest, right? And the presenter sort of gave away why this was important, right? He said, winning beauty in the favela is not simply winning a beauty contest. It is defeating prejudice, defeating the difficulties and obstacles, defeating social difference. Brazil is a country that has in its most impoverished communities great values, great talents that only need to be discovered. That is the Midas touch of our program through the reporters who went forth and made their discoveries, right? So they're painting beauty as this untapped natural resource that's just there, and you need to go discover it and bring these girls into beauty, right? And in fact, the prize was a modeling gig, right, for the winner, right? She would become a model, and that was the sign that she had made it, right? And the way that, they interviewed the winner, and the winner, of course, talked about, oh, now I can buy my parents a house, right? It was all about upward mobility in the discourse of the winner, right, of course. It's not simply TV that does this. I went to, you guys probably are familiar with Cidade de Deus, City of God. It's one of the biggest favelas in Rio de Janeiro. And they have a modeling school called Lente dos Sonhos, Dreamlands. And it's fascinating to me how the media talks. So the media was fascinated with it for a bit and would talk about it as amazing, and this is bringing these kids opportunities. It's quote unquote fashion in the service of citizenship. So this is why I talk about cosmetic citizenship, because it's clearly tied to national belonging in a very intense kind of way. And of course, right, the reality is it's very few of these women and few men who actually got anything out of this. In fact, for them it was more an expenditure. The parents of these teenagers were paying a monthly fee to get them to go to this modeling school, which is a very it was run by people in the community, right? It wasn't a big deal, but it was an extra expense. And when I would interview them why they were doing this, the parents would say, well, this is our ticket, right? If my daughter gets recognized as beautiful, we will get out of poverty in some kind of way or another, right? So beauty is seen as something tied to hope in very powerful ways. So the work of Ghassan Hage has been very influential in my work because he argues that hope is socially constructed as well. And he argues that any society has the capacity to produce and distribute hope amongst its members, but in the late capitalist society that we live in, it's distributed in very unequal fashion. Not everyone gets access to hope in the same way. And we only get access to hope in our society through two ways. One is identification with a state project, in which citizens believe they are part of something larger than themselves, right? And the second one is the illusion of our mobility. So despite massive inequalities that our capitalism depends on, right, individuals in highly precarious or uncertain situations believe against hope. They hope against hope that somehow, somewhere, upward mobility is going to be possible some way or another, and sometimes they take to magical means to achieve it. In my book, I talk about beauty as a magical value of late capitalism that seems to be within reach, right? In ways that other forms of mobility are not. So people invest in this because in Brazil, it's a reality that if you get a lot of education, it's no guarantee that you're going to move up, right? The stratification of Brazilian society is so intense that upward mobility is very difficult. So therefore, people think this is the way out, particularly for women. For men, it's mostly things like soccer, I thought of as upward mobility, because every once in a while, someone does become incredibly wealthy, right? Gisele Bündchen came from poverty, just like Ronaldinho and all these other soccer players came from poverty as well. So there's a sense that you can suddenly become a millionaire through beauty as a form of capital. So just to wrap up, cosmetic citizenship is sort of what I play with and what's in the title of my book, because beauty is so tied to national belonging. It's so tied to being someone in society, right? But cosmetic, right, points out the fact that maybe it's just an illusion, right? It seems like you're getting citizenship, but are you, right? And the way that it became most obvious to me was the fact that all these patients were agreeing to become experimental subjects because the people that were doing the surgeries in the public clinics were medical residents who were still in training, who were learning how to do surgeries. And all the patients I talked to were completely aware of this, right? But they said the risk of being ugly is higher than the risk of undergoing a surgery that might go wrong, but if it goes well, it might change my life, right? The patients accepted this risk, right? So a patient told me, I know they're studying me, but I don't care. I wouldn't have a way to pay otherwise. And the surgeons externalized the cost of surgery onto working class patients all the time. So I remember a patient had a surgery that she got a huge infection, right? It ended up having all these health problems. And the surgeon just blamed her. She said, well, she didn't rest. Why didn't she rest after the surgery? And he didn't even consider the ways that being a working class woman might not allow somebody to take weeks off and just rest, right? And so they always blamed the patients for any problems that occurred. It's very, very hard in Brazil for these women to sue. It's something I can expand upon in the question-answer period if you have one. I have a question about that. But the other thing that I found is that surgeons favor risky procedures if they promise to alter bodies more easily. So there's this very controversial technique, just to give you an example, called bioplasty, which is supposed to, unlike Botox, which is temporary, it's supposed to be a permanent reshaping of your face. It doesn't only take wrinkles out. According to plastic surgeons, it can reshape your jawline and everything about your face, right? So they promise you to become more beautiful, and in a lot of the ads, it's white women who are sort of showcased. And it's polymethyl methacrylate is the compound they're injecting into the body, which is very similar to acrylic glass. And every once in a while, women have horrible, I can take it off if it's disturbing. People have horrible reactions where they literally suffer necrosis and lose part of their face. And what fascinated me was not so much that this was happening, but that surgeons would defend it, the technique. And they would say, I went to one conference in particular where there was a whole 2 panels and a keynote speaker just dedicated to defending bioplasty. And the reason they gave is they said, this technique is so powerful and it allows me to reshape the body and the face. And I don't think we should stop using it, even if every once in a while it causes problems. So again, right, their ability to transform the body becomes before any patients having awful reactions, right? And what fascinates me as well is that it's expanding. So it's a Brazilian invention, right? It was discovered or it's developed in Brazil in these public hospitals. Now it's expanded into the private clinics as well. And now they're selling it to other countries. So this is an ad from Colombia, this is an ad from Peru about bioplasty, and it's the exact same compound. And it's a huge moneymaker because the laboratories that produce it are pursuing laboratories, right? So there's a monetary reason tied to the way that these things move transnationally, and the ways that the risk becomes downplayed by the doctors. So I want to end there to give time for questions because we're 5 p.m. But thank you.
Okay. Aaron.
Okay. Thank you. Very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I just you covered a lot of ground, and I think that for an American audience is too much ground
Maybe.
at one sitting, because I know Brazil a little bit. Since 1963, I guess, and I've lectured in at least 6 cities and so on. But I would say that I think it's easier to present your material to this kind of an audience or any university audience in the United States if you pointed out that in Hawaii, for example, you have many conditions that you described for Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
And the same is true in Jamaica, for example. So this is pretty common. I think if you point out that in America you have the same problems, but no one talks about it this way. But the same conditions are around, and I think it would make your argument even stronger and comparatively more interesting.
Yeah.
If you pointed this out, it's something that no one in this country wants to talk about openly all the time. But they do it in any city where there's, for example, African Americans or Latinos or something. And that immediately becomes a source of comment for them. And now the thing is that my understanding of some of these issues go back to a book I read in 1940 by a sociologist, PhD, Chicago, married a Brazilian woman, then went to live, and he wrote a book called Negroes in Brazil. Okay. Now, anyway, I just say that I think that you've got a lot more you can make of what you said if you thought about this comparatively speaking, because it's there. And many people say how horrible, but in the United States, it's everywhere, but especially when you have these mixed groups.
No, I agree. And plastic surgery is a global phenomenon. It's definitely not just Brazil. So I do try, my book, especially in the conclusion, I try to put in dialogue with the literature that's out there about other places.
But Brazil is a good example for showing.
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. And I appreciated the comparison and connection you made to eugenics in the US in the beginning. And it calls to mind the far right in the US and
yes, and in Brazil.
And I was wondering what you thought the current stakes of your data and your the people you talk to, particularly the poor and working class folks, given the election in Brazil and the potential or maybe even likelihood of a far right candidate. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the most awful thing about Bolsonaro is how much he's relying on this very misogynistic and homophobic and transphobic sort of return. So one of the things he rails against is what he calls gender ideology, and he says they are forcing us to accept gay people and trans people, and it's a sin, and he's evangelical, And unfortunately, right, there's a huge, just like in the US, there's a huge base of evangelical voters who are voting for him just because he's the evangelical candidate, the Christian candidate. And it's a return to family principles in some kind of way, according to this people. And what saddens me is that it's happening at a moment when the feminist movement in Brazil was gaining steam, the LGBT movement was gaining steam, and this is basically some sort of very intense backlash. And he uses, I mean, if you want to tie it somehow to beauty, I mean, he's misogynistic in the way that he rails against his female critics is by calling them ugly, right? So one female politician who critiqued him, he said, "You're so ugly, I would never rape you," right? So these horrible things that are using beauty and ugliness to devalue bodies that he thinks are against his norms are very openly used. But yeah, it's kind of horrifying that he might actually win the presidency because I think all the gains that were made are going to be lost very quickly. So right, and including critiques, right? Feminists were starting to critique plastic surgery, right? So that's going to also go away.
I'm also wondering, like, what years were your study anchored
Yes.
in? And I'm wondering how much, like, is there a Obama effect or a Wakanda effect that you're seeing in Brazil, in which Blackness is being wrestled with or renegotiated in a different way? And I would love to hear your
Yes.
talk about any of that.
So the Afro-Brazilian movement did. I was doing research in 2006 to 2010, on and off for 3 years. I would would go back and forth between Brazil and the United States, but I was there for a full 3 years. And at the time, the Workers' Party was in power, and they were very close to the Afro-Brazilian movement. So, for example, university affirmative action was implemented in public universities, and that was very controversial because, according to Brazilians, there's no racial problems in Brazil, so why would you ever need affirmative action? But the Workers' Party was like, no, there's huge social science evidence that racism exists in Brazil. It's real. We need to do something to change it. And I think there is part of the backlash is also like this return to like, oh, let's not think about race in that kind of way. But a lot of my work is inspired on Afro-Brazilian feminists who were writing about this already before me and saying this is the ways that the Negroid knows is obviously tied to racism, a long history of racism. So I don't know if you heard about Marielle Franco. So she was a very famous Afro-Brazilian activist who got murdered last year. And after her death, as horrible as it was, the Afro-Brazilian feminists are like gaining a lot of steam, and a lot of them are running for Congress. So in the midst of despair, I think there is a renewed sense of black identity in Brazil that's very strong.
But it hasn't bridged to this idea of black being beautiful in Brazil.
There have been campaigns, particularly in the city of Salvador, which is it has a much more Afro-Brazilian population. There have been actual Black is Beautiful campaigns. Afro-Brazilian activists talk about beauty as a central thing they need to work in society because they're so aware that blackness is tied to ugliness, and that's one of the ways that racism works in Brazil. So they're working towards undoing that, but of course, undoing it is a very complicated, hard project that might take decades, right? Or who knows, right? But it's in the air at least. At least people are addressing it.
I was curious about the comment about lawsuits.
Yes.
Could you expand on that, like why women cannot sue the plastic surgeons?
So wealthy women can sue, right? So you go to a private clinic, you can sue. But one of the ways that Brazilian plastic surgeons justify the surgeries in public hospitals is they say all these surgeries are technically reconstructive surgeries. They're repairing bodies that somehow have been broken in some kind of way. They're not aesthetic. So according to surgeons, these are not aesthetic surgeries, even though they clearly are. And because they make that distinction, which is a technical distinction, it becomes impossible for the women to sue because, first of all, it's very hard monetarily. So one patient told me, like, I just don't have the money for a lawyer, and they want me to do like a medical evaluation that's going to cost me more than the surgery cost me. So she said, it's just not going to happen, right? But even if they did, and if there was some way to get through those obstacles, it's very unlikely a judge would approve it because they would say, but this was a reconstructive surgery, so therefore you, like, let's say a heart surgery, right? If something goes wrong, it's not the fact if you get an aesthetic problem, in the results of the surgery, it has nothing to do with your health, so therefore you don't have the right to sue, right? That's one of the ways they get around it. But it's more a structural issue. Most of the women didn't even consider it because it was just too hard. And the lawsuits in Brazil take years and years and years, so it's just unfeasible if you don't have the money.
Deborah?
You mentioned, you kind of alluded to the fact that the sort of phenotypically, well, a typical Afro-Brazilian kind of wouldn't be eligible for surgery, like on her nose.
She would.
She would. So you mentioned some men who were not allowed to get, who weren't, it wouldn't be publicly funded because what they wanted, went against norms. So I'm kind of wondering, like, who's excluded? It's a public health right, and
Yes.
yet it's very much shaped by.
Yeah. So when I was talking, I was more fascinated with how the medical discourse described this woman as a patient who didn't deserve the surgery, right? But black women there are black women who want a thinner nose in Brazil, and it's not as if they're turned away. The people that I saw being turned away was mostly due to suspicion that their sexual orientation was not normative, their gender identity wasn't normative, and in those cases people were definitely excluded from surgery because they're just seen as they're not eligible in some kind of way.
Yes.
Since we are talking about politics and beauty,
Yeah.
is there a way, like you mentioned this type of look is kind of classified as a medical condition, but it is because the perception of it is negative. However, there is nothing wrong with the functionality of their looks. Is there any way to tell these people that you are beautiful is no why looks that is the right way to be, like it's okay to be different, that type of thing?
Well, that's why the Black is Beautiful campaigns, I think, are important, right? And that's why the Afro-Brazilian movement in Brazil is trying to convince people you're beautiful, right? Like, don't allow people to say that you're. So, for example, people call bad, right, Afro-Brazilian hair, they call it bad hair, right? So don't call it bad hair, it's just different hair, right? So there have been campaigns to try to change it, but you're going against 500 years of racism, right? It's a very uphill battle to change the way that aesthetics have been used to racially discriminate in Brazil.
I also have some questions on the tying into affect and upward mobility, because it seems a little contradictory for me. Well, it makes sense as you describe it, but at the same time, this idea of a gendered process, and then this tying into upward mobility. But is there any? I mean, is it also very much tied to an individual perception of beauty, or also even by, for example, does it mean that lower class women who are not looking white enough would also have a disadvantage in terms of finding a husband?
Yes.
Or and then the other way around. So what about the men? I mean, they don't have any problem. They can just pick and choose. Or I mean, why are they not affected by the standards?
So beauty standards for men are also high, but beautiful in handsomeness for men is tied to muscularity. So there's a huge, I don't work on this, but there's an anthropologist, a Brazilian anthropologist who works on the use of steroids in Brazil. So just like we see a rise of plastic surgery for women, what we usually see for men is huge rise in steroids and all these other products that men use to become hypermuscular, because that is what in the marriage market gets you, what's what makes you attractive, right? But it's all about physicality, muscularity, not necessarily about being handsome in a classical kind of sense, right? Men do want those surgeries, but the men who do want those surgeries get stigmatized for wanting, let's say, a nose job. So they do get it, but they hide it. They might not go to the public hospital. They might actually save up at a private hospital. So there's ways around it. So plastic surgery is rising in men very quickly, but it's not seen as the typical way to become handsome or beautiful.
I get cued, so yes.
I was just wondering if the women and the men know that the doctors, you said they're often not experienced, and they
Yes.
in the public hospital, do they know that they're inexperienced doctors?
Yes, they know that they're all young surgeons, so they're all medical residents who have gone through the first phase of medical school, but they're in the residency program. They're all young. The patients know that they're young. The patients know the patients use the word guinea pig. They said, "I know I'm a guinea pig, but," right? So the patients know this. They know that there's an exchange, right? That I'm getting this for free or for low cost because I'm a guinea pig.
Okay.
But they're willing to go through with it.
Well, I had two questions. Is one, thinking about that, is there like a hierarchy for doctors as far as if you're working in public clinics versus private clinics? And what are their thought processes around that?
So what's fascinating is they do both. So a lot of the surgeons that ran, so not the ones that were studying, but the ones that ran the residency programs in public hospitals, they had a private clinic. And doing both gave them a lot of symbolic capital because they could say, look, I help the poor people, and I'm a great humanitarian, but I also have my fancy private clinic in this southern neighborhood where I attend my wealthy clients, right? So they would transit, but the reason they do that is because the knowledge base that they build in the public hospitals they use then in the private clinics. They develop techniques that then are used in the private clinics. So the knowledge transits in one direction.
How's the life of these people change after the surgery? Do they get the job easier? Is this better life?
That's harder for me to determine, and I think that the magic of beauty is so powerful that people, it's sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They feel like their life has gotten better. They feel that their life has been transformed by plastic surgery, so therefore they make it change in some kind of way. I'm not 100% sure if it actually improves your chance of, let's say, getting a job, right? But it actually makes people feel better about themselves. It makes them more self-confident, so it might actually affect how they perceive themselves and how other people perceive them. But it's very hard for me to quantify the real effects on people's lives.
I have a question. Since I lived in Brazil for a while, I found, and you studied it, but I found through just casual observation, there's a clear regional difference in the idea. So that when I was in the Amazon area and I was in the south, the extreme south, near Uruguay and where that there were differences in the ways in which people even talked about this, and it was kind of related, my casual observations, to what constituted mobility in each one of those places, so that when there were less in the one case in the north, and particularly in Indian areas, indigenous areas, where there was less actually variation in mobility, that mobility actually wasn't racialized in itself because there are fewer whites, you get less of this concern about it, whereas in the South, when there was less African Americans ever, and where Bunchkin's from, these towns, nobody actually goes there no one gets allowed in there who's not German in one particular case or Italian in the other. It's so segregated on just ethnicity in these towns. It was remarkable for an outsider. And I wondered, getting back to her question, I mean, women have a certain way in which mobility occurs for them, and men have a certain way in which it occurs for them, and both of them are their body, but one's in labor, and the other one has to do with selling their body for labor purposes, and the other one has to do with beauty. So, in some sense, I was wondering if that's what you see in that these real crises periods happen in those particular cities where you get more mixing, that is, where you get more multi-ethnic, where you get more groups in. Than in the other places. I don't know.
It's hard for me to say because I've never done fieldwork in the Northeast. I've had people tell me that plastic surgery is becoming more important, but it's not as intense. It seems that the places where it's most intense is the Southeast and the South. So the places where there is this very intense segregation, right? So I think it makes the plastic surgery more important.
Of them, more different groups, yeah.
Right. But I did see this racial geography of beauty where whenever, let's say, a modeling scout would talk about beauty in television, they would say the southern regions of Brazil are more beautiful because there's more German and Italians.
Right,
And
exactly.
that's what beauty is. Beauty is whiteness,
Right.
right? And the north, not really, right? They're thought of as regions lacking in value because beautiful people don't live there, right? So it emphasizes the economic inequalities, right? The Northeast is the poorest region of Brazil, but it's also the less beautiful, right? So it goes along with this imagination of which parts of the country are developed and which parts of the country are underdeveloped.
Yes.
Since we were talking spatially,
Yeah.
where are these clinics mostly located? Are they located in the more poverty, racialized section of Brazil? Or there are these like situations where people really have to travel outside of their familiar neighborhoods to get to these?
They're all over the place. So in Rio de Janeiro in particular, but also in Belo Horizonte, I found that almost every federal, municipal, even university hospitals that are tied to the public health system, they would all have medical residencies like this. And some were located in universities, some were located in wealthier neighborhoods, and poor people traveled there. Some were located in working class neighborhoods, so people, it was more like close to where they lived.
So it's along regular sort of health clinics.
Yes.
This place will be okay.
Yeah, so almost every major hospital had a plastic surgery residency program. And they're big, powerful programs. So a lot of surgeons, there's this weird thing that's happening where there's too many plastic surgeons, and other disciplines like there's not enough pediatricians. Brazil has a dearth of pediatricians because it doesn't pay well, and no one wants to get that degree. And everyone wants to be a plastic surgeon because it makes a lot of money. So these are big residencies in almost every public hospital I did research on.
You know, I was going to ask him to comment on something that many of you may actually be interested in. One of the remarkable things for an American who goes there, it has to do with women. And he concentrated a lot on the face and some on the breasts. But one that's Africanized, it's really rampant, and that I found from my year in there, is the enormous plastic surgery on the butt.
Right.
And becoming Africanized. That is, white women, very white women, who have had no miscegenation in them at all, want to have an African bottom.
Which doesn't technically exist.
Yeah,
Right.
but I'm just saying they have it.
Right, but
They have a vision of it themselves, and I was at
What?
so that it actually becomes. There is some Africanization. There is some cross-cultural things going on that strikes an American, where you often get the opposite here, where you actually get anorexia or some very thin idea of what actually is beautiful. And there, the idea is maybe a waistline is. Well, that's what I found. You know better.
Although I did see, so a lot of the women, for example, get butt implants it's very common, for example, like among the music industry, right? So women who make it in the music industry sometimes get butt implants, and it becomes part of their act, right, in some kind of way. But I do remember the upper middle class white women, particularly in like Leblon and Ipanema, were very critical of those women, right? And they said they thought of it as crass, right? And they said, I don't want that for me, right? I want a dignified kind of refined beauty. Those people are unrefined, right? So creating a curvy body, even though it's very highly valued in Brazil to have that curvy body, is seen as something that's working class, crass, unrefined type of beauty.
Can I actually ask you a tangential question,
Yeah.
but related?
Yeah.
Is the understanding of whiteness being beautiful and plastic surgery coming along with that? And again, this idea of it actually becoming dangerous, right? To be beautiful and white in Brazil. Because what I've heard is that part of the plastic surgery is like the production of ears because of people getting kidnapped and ransom.
Oh, right.
And so, how do they negotiate being beautiful but not too beautiful, wealthy but not too wealthy, besides like going into helicopters and like and never touching the ground? How do they negotiate the possible dangers of being looking too wealthy or too beautiful and attracting the danger of being kidnapped and ransomed?
But what's interesting that's one of the reasons why Bolsonaro, the ultra-right candidate, is so popular, is because he's a law and order candidate who says we have too much crime in Brazil, there's too much kidnappings, etc. Vote for me, and we'll kill all the criminals. And his discourse is these people should be killed, and there should not even be trials. If you have a gun, and if they see you holding a gun, the police should have the right to just shoot you and not ask any questions. Shoot, ask, ask questions later. So it's more that Brazil has become more and more fascist, basically, as wealthy people have been put in situations of danger, right? So also security. So there's this fascinating book called City of Walls by Teresa Caldera, where she talks about the security in Sao Paulo becoming insane because instead of addressing the social inequalities that exist, what rich people do is they just build higher and higher walls and security mechanisms and videotaping mechanisms. They just surround themselves with higher and higher walls to separate themselves, even segregate them further from the poor. That's been the reaction, not fear that you should not look to
We're
what.
just going to make sure to mitigate any.
Right, so that I'm never unsafe, right?
One last question. Well, you can ask two. If you ask and you ask, and then he can answer both.
I just wanted to ask because about the example, basically, because if you did most of your observations in the clinic, and then if you had also instances where people were initially there for surgery, but then they decided, okay, it's too dangerous, I don't want to do it. I mean, this goes back to security, but at a different point, because maybe they realized, well, okay, these people seem very inexperienced, or the procedure, or they waited so long that they saw someone having this really horrible effect. And then they withdrew their application. Did you encounter that?
Yes, so it did happen. Or people that had close calls. So I remember a patient, she was gonna have a tummy tuck, and then she learned that the surgeon that was gonna do her surgery was actually had all these trials against him. He was actually in trouble already with the law because several patients of him had died, and she said, okay, maybe I shouldn't do this. It's too risky, right? So it's not that the patients were completely not doing a cost-benefit analysis. It's just that most of them seem to be well, if it seems not that risky, I'm willing to take the risk. But it's always because they thought of ugliness as riskier, right? As even worse. And they would tell me, this is not irrational. They would defend the reasoning as not irrational at all. And I talk a bit in the book about sort of rationality and how we can complicate that, right? Why people make the choices they do under duress, right?
If there is time, I'm curious to know a little bit more about the health insurance and how that operates in Brazil.
So they have a universal healthcare system. Okay. So the public hospitals where this is happening is covered under the universal healthcare system, right? And by the way, on other ways, the Brazilian public healthcare system is incredible, right? In the sense that very poor people can go to a cancer hospital and get completely 100% free care and pretty good chemotherapy and everything. So I'm completely in support of the public healthcare system in Brazil. I just talk in my book about basically how I interpret this is public healthcare is being co-opted by neoliberal private interests in the hands of plastic surgeons, right? So the plastic surgeons don't have the benefit of the population in mind, but rather their profit-making capabilities in the private market because they want to develop new techniques. So therefore, they're using the public health system for their own gain. So it's some kind of perversion of public health care as it should work. But it started with this idea of the right to beauty. Everyone should have the right. Should beauty be something that gets medicalized to the extent that you consider a basic health right? And should you stop thinking about it being a social, something that you can change society to think about beauty differently, right? As opposed to changing bodies to make them fit the beauty standards. That's the main issue.
I want to encourage you all to actually get his book. I mean, it's really a remarkable book, and in all presentations, that can't get everything that's really in this book, and it's published by the University of California Press, and it is the title of the talk today.
The Biopolitics of Beauty.
And now, this is my time to ask you to give a round of applause for her.